this permission, if you will, is still on the books, but every FDA commissioner treats it a little differently, so you can't really count on being able to do that. Now, what happened after that is when companies like the one I worked for, the Upjohn Company, started to develop drugs for AIDS. The AIDS community didn't want to wait that extra 10 years for it to get on the market, so they just hired black market chemists to make them. Consequently, when we finally had a new drug and we wanted to put it in people, we found that every AIDS patient in the country who wanted it already had our drug. So we couldn't do the test because these patients would develop resistance, so we had to wait until new cases were diagnosed to actually run the tests that the FDA required of us. Now, what's interesting is these people actually had a very admirable safety record, and they really, in spite of the fact that they were breaking the law and everyone knew it, and Times Magazine ran articles on them, nobody did anything because the FDA didn't want to have a hullabaloo, which the AIDS activists would have created, and letting people know that these delays were killing people. And the pharmaceutical companies weren't about to do it either because these are their future patients. So they got away with this. In fact, I understand there's a Brad Pitt movie coming out called The Dallas Buyers Club, which tells this story. And actually, if you notice at the bottom of the slide, the author Whitney actually wrote a book called Acceptable Risks, in which he describes the evolution of this AIDS community opt-out. So if people are dying, waiting for these new drugs, just how many are there? Well, the next slide shows the calculations. You can actually do these because we know how many people are helped by drugs. Now, don't bother looking at the calculations other than the bottom line. 4.7 million people have died waiting for drugs that we know are effective because of this 10-year delay, on average. This is a lot of people. And you might ask yourself, gee, is that it, or is there more? Well, there's more. There's a lot more. In fact, the next slide shows that what did we do? 2 slides? Yeah. Let's go back one. Or is that it? Okay, yes. Yes, see, it's not just about new drugs. The slide I showed you with 4.7 million people dying waiting for new drugs, these are new drugs, okay? These are new ones. But you know, there's a lot of old drugs that could be pretty helpful too. You know, aspirin, for example. Right after these 62 amendments were passed, Bayer Aspirin wanted to go and put out a little calendar pack for heart patients because they already were getting information that aspirin might help people with heart disease. But when they found out all the hoops they had to jump through to get approval, they said, we can't do this, it's too expensive, we'll never recover our costs because aspirin is not patentable anymore. And so we're going to lose our money because it's going to go generic the first day. And so because of this, we had, you know, almost a 20-year delay in recognizing aspirin's benefit. And so because of this, you see, because of the high development time and high development costs, which I'm going to show in a minute, patents have become indispensable, really, in the drug development industry. And they didn't used to be. When I started, we were still developing drugs without patents. Now, the other thing is these regulations were passed in the wake of the thalidomide tragedy. There was a drug put out in Europe, which when pregnant women took it, created problems with the fetus. They would be born with either without limbs or with shriveled limbs. And that was, of course, very, very sad. But these regulations did nothing to stop that kind of thing. In fact, they actually created what I call the American thalidomide. What is that? Well, we knew actually since the early 80s, that if a woman took folic acid before her pregnancy, she could virtually wipe out the chance that her child would have spina bifida. But the FDA wouldn't let the folic acid manufacturers talk about this B vitamin. It's a vitamin, for heaven's sakes. It's not a drug. Because if they did, without jumping through all these regulatory hoops, then they felt they'd have to let the pharmaceutical companies have a shortened path too. So they said, well, no, you have to go through all these regulations. Of course, folic acid isn't patentable either. So as a consequence, even after the Center for Disease Control, another government agency, started recommending that women of childbearing potential, take folic acid every day, just in case they got pregnant, the FDA told the folic acid manufacturers that they'd shut them down if they even mentioned this. Consequently, the American public was not educated about this for about 12, 15 years. And we had more babies born with spina bifida than we ever had thalidomide babies. And we don't even know how many were aborted, because of course you can test for this in utero, and a lot of those babies were aborted. So the very tragedy that these amendments were supposed to prevent actually created something right here in the US. Whereas thalidomide was mostly in Europe, we created it here with our FDA. Now, you might say, well, but weren't there some lives saved by these regulations? Well, there might have been a few. In the next slide, we calculate exactly how many we think there might be. And if you scroll down on this slide a little bit, you'll see the bottom line, which is that if you look at all the things that happened before 1962, and you try to calculate what it would be over the years these amendments were in effect, then you see that maybe about 7,000 lives would have been saved. 7,000. Now, even if this estimate's off by a factor of 100, and you multiply by 100, and you get something like 700,000, it's still a lot less than that 4.7 million of people who just died waiting. And I've just begun to tell you the bad news. I have only just begun, unfortunately. Now, why is this? Well, if you look at the next slide, you see why unsafe drugs get to market. And basically, the thing is that most of the safety testing in the 60s was adequate for our state of knowledge. But the problem is, and I see we have a technical problem too, the problem is that we didn't have enough science to predict the thalidomide tragedy. Thalidomide only has those effects in primates and in one strain of rabbits. So it didn't matter how many laboratory animal studies were done, it would never have been picked up. We only began to appreciate with the thalidomide tragedy that there was indeed a problem. So that's what happens today as well. If we can predict it from animal studies, we don't develop the drug. But if we can't, and that happens a lot because people are not rats, as much as we might think so at times. So, it's not possible really to predict everything. So every time you take a drug, you want to remember that there are some risks involved. It's not just safety free. Okay, there we go. All right, we're back in business. So now that we have this slide, we'll go to the next one. And basically, what I'm showing here, we're not going to get real fancy here, but basically what I'm showing is that if we had had the same development costs that were happening before 62, you see this line here is what we would have predicted out here in the 2000s if the pre-amendment development cost trends had continued. If these amendments hadn't been passed, we'd be somewhere around here. But because the amendments were passed, look at this dramatic increase in cost for development for new drugs. Well, of course you would expect it based on the increase in time. That's nothing new. But if you look at the next slide, what you see is these development costs are linked totally to what we pay our pharmacist. There's a correlation, a very tight correlation between the R&D cost of a drug and what you're charged at the pharmacy. That's one way that manufacturers calculate what they're going to charge you. Of course, they have to take into account all the failures too. So it's not just that one drug. So it does make a difference how much you regulate. It influences what you pay at the pharmacy, and that's why drug costs are so high. In fact, the next slide, you basically see the summary of this whole thing, which that if pre-amendment trends had continued, the price you pay at the pharmacy would be about 15% of what we pay today. That's a huge increase. It's huge. Now, you might say, well, we'd be willing to pay this extra money if all this effectiveness testing actually saved us money on wasteful drugs that didn't work. But studies show that prior to 1962, only about 10% of the drugs really weren't very effective. And that's actually a generous estimate. 10%. Because the marketplace had already taken care of it. If physicians saw their patients weren't benefiting, they didn't prescribe it. So the marketplace was already regulating it well enough. Now, I told you I had only just begun. So now we're going to start doing the heavy hitting. The next slide talks about what really matters, loss of innovation. Innovation has been at least cut in half.